Questions about the Russian Revolution, World War II, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution? Toward the end of the Cultural Revolution in the United States, conservative Christians were making an impact on the politics of the United States. In the early years of the 20th century, conservative evangelicals, or fundamentalists, that we'll talk about later, had largely retreated from public life and politics. And they had developed a rather separatist mindset. And a variety of things that we'll talk about later on in the 20th century, or later on in this look at the 20th century. But essentially what had happened was, in the 19th century, Christianity had been so intertwined with making impact on culture and society and politics. But by the early 20th century, conservative Christians began to retreat. But by the middle of the 20th century, some of these fundamentalists wanted to be more involved, particularly in shaping the political destiny of the United States and the world. The precursor for this engagement was the ministry of Billy Graham. Graham was born in 1918 near Charlotte, North Carolina. Still alive, so he's getting close to his 100th birthday, but is very ill, so there are certainly questions as to whether he'll reach that. He graduated from Wheaton College, which was an evangelical institution. He would later join the staff of an organization called Youth for Christ, which was a group that was focused on evangelizing teenagers and adults. And for a while he was going around working with Youth for Christ, but he decides he wants to kind of embark on his own, and he wants to reach a broader audience than just teenagers and young adults. So he goes around and holds these campaigns across the country, but he's not particularly successful. He goes overseas for a little bit, has some success over there in England, comes back. And what really changes Graham's life is a crusade he holds in 1949. It starts off kind of, again, not that big of a deal, but eventually a few prominent celebrities and athletes claim conversion after going to this Billy Graham crusade, and so that starts to get more attention from the public, and so more and more people start attending these crusades. It goes on for a while. Additionally, a lot of Graham's message was a concern about communism and the impact of atheistic communism on the world and what that would do to Christianity and what that would do to the United States. And so this anti-communist message gains the attention of a newspaper owner named William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst, who was very anti-communist, sees Graham. Right? He's a young man. He's 30 years old. He wears a suit and tie, very well dressed, very articulate. There's a lot of things that Hearst sees in Graham that he really likes. And so he tells his reporters two of the most famous words in Graham that will have an impact in Graham's life: puff Graham. Essentially saying anything positive you can say about Billy Graham, find a way to work it in. I want you to focus on talking about Billy Graham, talk about his message. And that's what really changes a lot of Billy Graham's life. And his success explodes after that. So much so that he will gain access to presidents from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. Even President Obama, I believe, has met with him as well. In 1960, although Graham has tried to be apolitical, right? He's often tried to say, I'm not interested in politics, I'm interested in saving souls. But in 1960, he met with other evangelical leaders who were interested in preventing Catholic John Kennedy from becoming president, obviously unsuccessful. But despite Graham's involvement with politics, among other things, most fundamentalists were still skeptical about getting involved in politics in American culture. It wasn't something that was encouraged in fundamentalist churches. You weren't really to be involved in voting or any other type of political activity. But a variety of lawsuits in the 1970s brought fundamentalists and evangelicals into the political sphere of the United States. Now, many people might point to the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 about abortion as the moment that sparked evangelical resurgence in politics. Now, certainly, after Roe v. Wade, many in evangelicalism became very active in denouncing abortion and looking for ways to limit it. There wasn't too much of an outcry against Roe, against that decision until the 1980s. Abortion was always looked upon as a Catholic issue by evangelicals. That was something Catholics worried about. And so even though many evangelicals were anti-abortion, they weren't very politically active against it, even after Roe. Instead, what seems to be the case that brings fundamentalists back involved in politics is an attempt by the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University was a fundamentalist university in South Carolina and was very racially discriminatory in its admission policies. It wouldn't allow African Americans to enroll. The only African Americans that were on the campus were those that were in service type of jobs. And so the IRS looking at this decides that because it's racist, that does not qualify as a charitable institution, so it shouldn't be tax exempt. This concern over these laws and abortion and the need to be politically involved coalesced into an organization known as the Moral Majority. Evangelicals throughout the 80s, Moral Majority. So the Moral Majority kind of plays on this fear of the government taking an attack on evangelical and fundamentalist institutions and decides to become politically involved in a variety of elections. In 1976, Newsweek magazine had a cover story called The Year of the Evangelical. Georgia Governor and Baptist Jimmy Carter was elected through evangelical hopes that he would help reshape the country. But evangelicals soon became dissatisfied at some of Carter's policies, as well as his appointment of a variety of non-evangelicals to administration posts. And so this is where the Moral Majority really gains power. So there's this disaffection with Carter. And so they take that and turn it into support of Carter's opponent in 1980, Ronald Reagan. And Reagan very astutely and successfully garnered the evangelical vote and the presidency. Some evangelicals also became dissatisfied with Reagan and weren't as supportive of his vice president, George Bush. And so evangelical televangelist Pat Robertson, who had been a strong supporter of Reagan but was concerned about Bush, decided to run for the presidency in 1988. He had some early success in some of those very early primaries, but Bush's popularity among other Republicans eventually leads Robertson to withdrawal. The Moral Majority disbands in 1989. And after Robertson kind of winds down his presidential campaign, he still believes his supporters could be a powerful political force. And so he develops a group known as the Christian Coalition, which is going to essentially fill the vacuum of the disbanding of the Moral Majority. The moral majority had focused largely on national elections, right? Presidential elections, believing that the way the country's going to change is if we change it top down. The focus of the Christian coalition, on the other hand, was more of a grassroots. Right? They still believed it was important who you elect as president, who you elect as your senators or your representatives, but they focused more on, we need to get Christians, evangelicals on school boards. We need to get them in as county commissioners. And so the belief was if you make an impact on those local levels, eventually that's going to impact at the top as well. Evangelicals were instrumental in the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000, as well as the year 2004. Younger evangelicals, however, have been less accepting of this kind of marriage between politics and Christianity. So it's uncertain how that will play itself out in the future. Questions about the Christian coalition, the Christian right? Christians, however, weren't just politically active in conservative causes. There were others as well. Not all evangelicals were supportive of this kind of marriage between the Republican Party and evangelicalism. In fact, since the middle of the 20th century, there were many evangelicals who felt that evangelicalism was losing its focus on the impact it should make politically. Fundamentalism had stressed individual salvation. And so in this period where fundamentalism is kind of out of the political influence, the focus is on individual salvation. We change the world as we convert people. And so there's less of this concern for cultural change, again, until the 1970s. Now, fundamentalists did speak out on communism, had been active in some local levels, but largely many of the doctrines of fundamentalism discouraged being active, discouraged social change. So we've looked at conservative evangelicalism. Let's backtrack and look at the other option. Now, conservative and liberal here are referring to their political views, not to the approach to the Bible. Often, conservatives and progressives in evangelicalism held similar theological views, right, about the inspiration of Scripture, the historicity of miracles and Jesus' resurrection. They just held different political views. One of the key figures in the development of this progressive evangelicalism was a man named Carl Henry. Henry was a preacher, an academic, an editor. He was born in 1913 on Long Island, but his parents were largely irreligious. At the age of 19, he becomes a reporter, eventually an editor for a newspaper, before experiencing conversion in 1933. He would go on to enroll at Wheaton College in Illinois. And the professors there at Wheaton encouraged him to see the Christian mission as not just about individual salvation, but about cultural transformation as well. He would go on to get a PhD from Boston University, eventually teaching at Fuller Theological Seminary in California. In 1947, he releases the work, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. Now, remember, Henry essentially is a fundamentalist. But what he's focusing on is the way that fundamentalism has largely abandoned bringing about cultural change. Fundamentalism, said Henry, was not humanitarian. It did not address the modern evils of the 20th century, things like aggressive warfare, racial hatred, exploitation of labor by management. Fundamentalism, which had come out of the very socially active evangelicalism of the 19th century, had no social passion in the 20th. Fundamentalism was only focused on the evils of alcohol, movies, dancing, without realizing that the gospel spoke to all of life. But on the other hand, liberalism, which was so focused on some of those social issues, ignored the need for personal salvation. And so Henry wants to see, personal salvation, but cultural salvation as well. So he's advocating a conservative theology. He's also advocating right living, addressing social issues. The text advocated progressive reforms, but was general and overly broad, and so it doesn't really make that much of an impact. He would eventually become one of the early editors of Christianity Today. But it's still a period of time when political activism is looked down upon. Fundamentalists do assume that the key to social transformation is personal conversion. Many evangelicals, Henry especially, were not quite sure where to stand on civil rights. Many, especially in the North, took a gradualist position, meaning that eventually transformation would take place. It shouldn't be pushed for politically. Billy Graham, for example, would hold integrated crusades. He would have people of all sorts of races present in his crusades and wouldn't separate, the blacks sit over here, the whites sit over here. But he encouraged Martin Luther King to, as he put it, or as he said, put on the brakes. Others favored more progressive action, including federal intervention, integration, protest marches, demonstrations, right? All this is trying to figure out how do you be Christian and be involved in politics. One of those individuals was a man named John Anderson. Anderson was a white racial activist. And one of the things that Anderson claimed was God is not just concerned about souls, He's concerned about bodies as well. Right? And so focus just on personal conversion without trying to address some of these social issues like racism isn't truly sharing the gospel of God. He worked at a black fundamentalist college for a while. He joins the NAACP. Would eventually found Freedom Now, a magazine dedicated to convincing fundamentalists to accept equality as biblical. Segregation, he said, is a sin. He eventually would get a job teaching at Wheaton, where he would encourage racial concern among the students. And in his lectures, he would begin incorporating insights from black activists, and then he would also include them in the magazine as well. By the late 1960s, however, resistance from other people to Anderson's civil rights push forced him to leave. Another political issue in the latter part of the 20th century for the evangelical left was Vietnam. Many evangelicals, in fact many Americans, supported the Vietnam War in the beginning. As the war went on, however, more and more people grew concerned about it. Communism was spreading in Vietnam, and a lot of people thought containment was necessary. But people began to question whether Vietnam was a just war, due to the amount of violence, the mass death, the loss of loved ones, all of which were for the first time talked about on the news. Scenes were filmed and then were shown on the news, and so people got to see firsthand what was happening over in Vietnam. And so some people became very concerned about this. One progressive evangelical that was very active in this was a man named Jim Wallace. Early on in his life, his focus had been on injustice, racism, supporting the idea that Jesus was on the side of the poor and marginalized. He would go to Trinity Evangelical Seminary in Chicago to be trained as a theologian. But he would become very vocal on campus about Vietnam, peacemaking, and radical generosity. All these things he thought were consistent with the Sermon on the Mount. He would eventually stop his studies because his activism was taking up so much of his time. Wallace still is active politically, progressively. Another important progressive evangelical in the latter 20th century is Mark Hatfield, a senator from Oregon, who just passed away a couple of years ago. He was born in 1922 and grew up in Oregon. His father and mother both had stable jobs, and so they largely weathered the Great Depression. There wasn't the difficulties that a lot of other people faced during the time. He would become politically active at the age of 10, handing out campaign literature. He would work for the Secretary of State of Oregon while he was in college, eventually going on to serve in the Navy in World War II. But while serving in the Navy, he sees the devastation that the nuclear bombs caused. When he comes back, he studied political science at Stanford, teaches as a professor for a while. Eventually, he's elected to the state legislature, will become Secretary of State, will become governor as well. He was a progressive Republican. He's socially conservative on abortion, really before it was the thing to be. I mean, we think now of a lot of Republicans, for example, being anti-abortion. But again, in those early years, the 70s, the 80s, the 60s and the 70s, there wasn't that much of an issue. But Hatfield is one of the first to really be socially conservative on this issue. But he's also concerned about labor issues, aid to the poor and elderly. He's concerned about environmentalism, racism. He will eventually go on to question whether Vietnam was a just war as well. He's elected to the United States Senate in 1966. It's shortly after that he will become anti-war. Between 1967 and the middle of 1968, he would give 150 anti-war speeches. He was considered for being the vice president on the Nixon ticket in 1968, but he isn't chosen and would eventually go on to work against some of Nixon's policies, especially when it concerned Vietnam. Ultimately, though, the evangelical left was politically unsuccessful. They were unsuccessful on one hand because other liberals, non-Christian liberals or liberals from other traditions, did not like their conservative theology. And so the fact that they were conservative theologically, believed the Bible was the Word of God, believed in some other things that other liberals didn't like, they weren't very supportive of that. They didn't like the fact that many of these evangelical liberals were also very anti-abortion. And so there's a lack of maintaining a good relationship there. Conservative evangelicals, on the other hand, didn't like their politics. And so they don't like a lot of the positions they're taking. The religious right, the Christian right, was much more successful than the evangelical left, particularly because it was embraced by conservatives, especially Republicans.